Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. We honor creators, and today we have Taylor Petrey, who is an author historian, and we're going to talk about his life and his books that are out there. Thank you for coming on the show, Taylor.
Glad to be here, Gene.
So let's talk about your formative years. Where did you grow up, and what was your experience like as a growing up youth in your neighborhood?
Yeah. I grew up in the 1980s, 1990s in South Jordan and Sandy, Utah. Actually, in the other order, Sandy first, and then moved to South Jordan in my middle school and high school years. And grew up in a LDS home. My parents were both members of the church who had met at BYU, but neither of them were from Utah originally. One was from Pittsburgh and the other from Denver primarily. And they had both lived in various other places around the country. They had never lived in Utah. So in many ways, I always felt like, I grew up in Utah. I felt a part of Utah, but my parents never really did. So I was, that was maybe my part of my early years, at least as a young person.
And did you visit grandparents and things in Denver and Pittsburgh?
My grandparents had moved around the same time that my parents were in their college years. I think my mother's parents maybe moved when I was like 8 or something like that to Bountiful. And so most of them had kind of ended up back there, but I had one that was still in Pittsburgh and we would go and visit him, my grandfather, my father's father. But for the most part, everybody kind of had ended up in Utah at that point.
Okay. I guess you were a baptized Mormon as well. And what was your experiences as a deacon, teacher, priest? Did you have leadership positions and stuff like that?
I must have. I don't know. I maybe did. I did a lot of scouting and things along those lines. I guess maybe the one unusual thing about my teenage years was that I decided when I was in 8th grade that I was never going to cut my hair again. And so I grew it out for about 3 years. It got really pretty long. And my parents, I'm still kind of annoyed about it, kind of tricked me into cutting it because I needed money. And they said, well, we have a job for you, but the condition of the job is that you have to cut your hair. So I cut my hair. And then it turned out that the job never materialized in the end anyway. And so I started all over again and grew it all out until I had to take my mission picture. So I had really long hair all through high school, middle school, high school.
Were you going to be a rock star?
No, it was just, I don't know. I thought it was
a fashion statement.
Fashion statement. And part of it was, I guess, my own like little rebellion against everybody and everything was that I was going to be a really good kid and not look like I was a really good kid.
Sort of like surprise people.
Yes. Yeah. So like everyone would be confused at the same time. So.
Yeah. I remember having a similar thing where I wanted to like wear mismatched socks or dress down so that when I would come into a room, people had low expectations and then I would wow them with whatever extra I could present. I had a hard time thinking about living up to high expectations. I wanted to be sort of surprising in a way. And so as you're going through high school, did you have favorite subjects?
I really liked political science and I thought I wanted to study political science. I was really influenced by a lot of my teachers and thought I wanted to be a teacher at first as well. And maybe the other like big formative experience for me was that I ended up on the high school debate team. And for, a lot of great support and a lot of good luck, we ended up being a nationally competitive team. And I traveled all over the country as a junior and senior in high school at the highest level of debate tournaments. And so in that way, I was really exposed to not only the much bigger world out there than many students would necessarily get as high school students, and getting to travel, getting to work with students, debate against students from Florida, New York City, and California, and some of our big rivals all around the country. And some of those people I'm still friends with after all of these years that I debated against, which is fun.
Yeah. So logic and rhetoric and persuasive communication and thinking on your feet. A lot of skills there. A lot of skills.
A lot of that, a lot of research. And so we were reading, about different political theories and history, and the debate topics that we had. My senior year was about whether or not the United States should have a universal healthcare program. And so in the 90s, I was deep into like healthcare debates back then,
And so as a debater, you would want to know both sides of the issue really, really well.
Well, you come to realize not only are there more than two sides, but that every argument has a weakness. Every argument is imperfect. There is a downside to everything, and you're always just weighing the pros and the cons, and your job is to try to make the pros look like they're bigger than the cons, but there's always something,
Right.
and that was a really, really helpful intellectual lesson to learn, is that I really kind of didn't believe that everything had to be perfect, that truth had to be, airtight, that
One eternal round.
Yeah. That, okay, you try on ideas and you might be convinced by something, but you have to be able to see the other side to it as well. And take seriously criticisms of the argument. And so, yeah, these were really, really formative intellectual years for me in those young years. And I went on to debate in college as well. And I debated at a school in New York City. I was recruited to go debate there. And so that was a really, big part of my life and a big part of how I came to be, I guess.
That's right. People are not dumb if they think differently than you. That's a good lesson too.
Yeah.
And so you got recruited. So you're going to leave home as a wash behind the ear 18-year-old and head out of state.
Yeah. So I ended up in New York City, and we were also nationally competitive team there before my mission as a freshman in high school, or freshman in college. And then I went on a mission right after that. By the time I got back, I sucked at debate. I was not very good anymore.
Wow. That's interesting.
It was in part because 2 years of being out of it, 2 years plus, it was ended up being about 2.5, just how my, when my mission call landed and so on.
And thinking celestial means you don't think terrestrial very often.
Yeah. But, the event evolves and new arguments come along, and the amount of work that was required. I mean, I was putting in 40 hours a week, often in high school, even, for this event, and then in college as well. And
so a mission was almost like vacation to you.
Oh, it was great. I was like, wow, you can do other things, and you can, think about other things besides debate. That's great.
And where'd you go on your mission?
I went to Italy.
Italy.
Yeah.
So you learned Italian. Mm-hmm. Now, were you able to go see sites?
Well, Italy is a big place, and there were 4 missions at the time. And so my mission was kind of carved out one little section of it. So I didn't get to Rome ever because it was outside of my mission until maybe about 8 years ago or so. I went back, and then I went back again maybe a year and a half ago or so for an early Christianity fellowship. We'll get to my career in early Christianity later.
Sure.
So
like Rolling Hill and Vineyards, is that where you were?
I was in Tuscany and Veneto. So Venice and Florence and Pisa, those were all a part of my mission, and we got to see that stuff every day. We did
this in front of the Leaning Tower.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. We played a game of football in Pisa with a bunch of elders,
and probably really great food too.
It was great food when we rarely got invited over to someone else's house. When the missionaries were cooking, it was awful, and I got completely sick of the food that the missionaries would eat.
Spaghetti every day.
Yeah. But it was a really great experience. It was a hard place to be a missionary, but a beautiful place to get to live and to get to experience the Italian culture and people.
Do you have any famous mission presidents or anything? Anybody become a 70 or anything?
I just had one mission president while I was there. Again, just how that worked. He passed away a few years ago. Absolutely wonderful man. I was a little bit shocked to return from my mission and hear that other people had bad mission presidents, and I couldn't believe it because mine was one of the most wonderful people I'd ever met, still have ever met in my life, and was very, very
lots of people are its experience is you never hear of two bad mission presidents in a row. They either start off with a bad one and get a good one, or start off with a good one and then things turn sour. But for you had one that was good and all the way through. Now, was part of your mission like to get investigators like will teach English?
Yeah, we did. That was a pretty much universal thing, I think, at the time. I don't know if they still do it, but yeah, we had an English language program, and we weren't directly using it to recruit investigators by any means, but it was something else to do, at least.
So it's part humanitarian, part otherwise we'll be twiddling our thumbs or reading the Book of Mormon for the 50th time.
Might as well make some use of our time and make some friends while we were there. Sure.
Yeah. And so you come back from your mission and things are different. And so you start shifting what your future is going to look like.
Yeah. So I got really into studying religion, really into studying the scriptures when I was a missionary. Again, there wasn't much else to do, and so I really devoted myself to my studies and kind of channeled my debate research skills into this new, full-time thing that I was doing. So I came back from my mission and I thought, well, I want to maybe make a career out of all of this. Maybe this is what I could do to teach, and I thought, well, the only jobs that I knew that were available were like seminary and institute teacher. And I thought, okay, well, I could see myself doing something like that. As I mentioned, I was in school in New York City and decided to take a class on the history and religion of the Middle East as one of the first classes that I took when I got back. And it was a 2-part class. And so it was 2 classes in one. And so it was double the amount of credits, double the amount of time, double the amount of work. And this was still one of my favorite classes that I've ever had in my entire life. And after 2 days in that class, I said, I don't want to be a seminary and institute teacher. This is what I want to do. I want to be a professor and teach religion. And this was
how far back in Middle Eastern religion do they go historically?
We started with Abraham. We started with the Abraham legends and kind of worked our way up to.
So did you learn like there's hints of Mesopotamian culture in those stories at all?
Yeah, it was an undergraduate class, and even in being a double class, trying to cover nearly 4,000 years worth of history, we definitely didn't do all of it, but we sort of focused on Jewish history, then Christian history, then Islamic history as the kind of main areas. But it's certainly in graduate school as I began to study more, learning the kind of broader cultural context of ancient Judaism and Israelite religion were those things were absolutely a part of it.
Did it sort of go like to 1000
BCE?
Yeah. 1000 AD, I guess. What's AD in the new thing?
Yeah, CE. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So was that weird because they probably did the BCE and the CE and you're like, what's wrong with AD and
I adapted maybe it was weird for 10 seconds. I adapted pretty quickly. Again, I had gone to school outside of Utah. It was a debate.
You were cosmopolitan. You were a man of the world. You'd been to Italy.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like, those, the classroom experiences weren't super. Well, I guess there are maybe 2 stories that I do think back on and reflect. And one was not long after that class, I then took, I think, my first intro to the New Testament. And it happened to be that we were also teaching the New Testament in Sunday school for that year's curriculum. And I was in the singles ward in New York City, which was an absolutely amazing ward. Really bright, wonderful people there. And in the mid and late 90s, it was full of people in law school and iBankers and
top notch
MBA. Some of the most amazing. Again, I'm still friends with many of those people, and they're very, very impressive group of people. And Sunday schools were often, incredible because when you get that kind of brain power in a room and people who are really interested and invested in thinking. So I remember being so impressed, but then I started taking just an introductory class in the New Testament. and felt like I had learned more in 2 or 3 weeks of that class about the New Testament than I had learned in an entire lifetime and in all of my mission. And it's like, oh, that's what's going on here. This is what's happening.
Right.
And became kind of disillusioned with Sunday school and felt very alone. It felt very isolating. I felt like, am I the only person in the whole church that knows this stuff? Why doesn't anybody else know, basic introductory information here,
Right. Because in a way, our experience in Sunday school is there's a quote from the New Testament, and then here's how we interpret that for our life.
Yes.
You were learning, here's all this stuff that happens, and then this quote happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you get all the context and everything.
And it can be, and for many people it is, and this is the case, I think, for people who study church history for the first time and encounter all of this stuff, disorienting, because you feel alone, that you have this information and no one's talking about it, and no one's thinking about, like, well, what does that mean for this or that, and
it's more fascinating too.
Yeah. And it felt some, in some ways, again, I'm thinking back to my early 20s, but it felt like, is this a waste of time, what we're doing here?
You mean in Sunday school? In
Sunday school. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I was fortunate to kind of find my people there, and we ended up starting a great, study group, and we would, think deeply about things, and we'd put together reading lists and work through this stuff together, so it ended up being a really enriching time for my faith. But those I do remember some of those early experiences. The second early experience was that I was, I usually don't talk about all of my background stuff, because I think I'm kind of a pretty boring guy, but you've got me on the roll here. I was an EFY counselor after I got back from my mission for a couple of years as well. And also kind of felt a little bit, as towards the end of that, a little bit of disillusionment with the project, and a little, out of place maybe, but it was during one of those summers where in my free time, I read 3 books.
Were you doing the EFI back east, or did you come back to?
I was in Provo. Yeah, I was the main one in Provo. But at that time, again, it's changed many times over the years, but at that time you were a full-time counselor in Provo, and then you would usually do 2 or 3 or 4, excursion ones. So I would fly to South Carolina, or we'd go up to BYU, Idaho, and do some of the off campus BYU ones. So anyway, had absolutely great experiences doing all of that. But one of those summers I read Quinn's Magic and the Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. I read a book on the historical Jesus, and I read a book on sort of a deconstructive approach to Moses. So I thought, all right,
historical Jesus book from Bart Ehrman or somebody
else? It was another a scholar named E.P. Sanders, who is also a fantastic scholar, an earlier era. But anyway, I was sort of like, all right, I've ripped off the Band-Aid here for all of these things. Everything is problematic. Everything is complicated. And then it was a kind of, then I guess the rest of the story is the rest of the story. But those are some of my early college experiences, at least.
And so you were dealing with this new information juxtaposed against the really good experiences you had most of your life, probably, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't any, and including ongoing. I like I mentioned, I ended up finding great people in my ward and other people who were interested in this. One of the people that I ended up becoming really good friends with had just finished a master's degree in Jewish studies at Oxford University. And I was like, oh, okay, there are other people out there who are also thinking about these things. And, I was blessed to be at one of the great singles wards in the church, really, in New York City, there with so many amazing people. And I found other people who were like me, and including Richard and Claudia Bushman, who were, of course, in New York City at the time as well, and became good mentors and friends during that era too.
Did you have firesides at their house or anything like that?
I got involved in a local New York City LDS history project that they were involved in. So they had kind of gotten some grant money, and they were going to study LDS history in New York City. And this went all the way back to, the 19th century and more modern things. And they were telling the history of the stake and the history. And it was really fascinating to kind of get to work with them as they were putting this together. And by luck, really, I fell into this group and ended up having a monthly meeting at their house for 3 years, where we would have a potluck with 8 or 9 people, and then he was also working at the time on the beginnings of rough stone rolling. And he would share chapters with me and a few other friends and invite us over to discuss draft chapters of them,
Wow.
And then after I graduated from my undergraduate and before I started my master's degree, I got a summer fellowship to work with him for the entire summer, doing Joseph Smith research. And this was a program that he ran for a number of years. And just an update that me and a few other friends are kind of restarting this idea of like this summer fellowship for young graduate students, because it was such an important moment for me. But we learned to research in Mormon history, and we learned to, think, and we got together, work with Richard Bushman every single day, and work with all of these other great scholars that he would invite in to talk with us, to mentor us, to argue with us, to inspire us. It was really, really a special time. And so I kind of was lucky to find Mormon scholars relatively early and feel like, oh, this is where I belong.
And Richard and Claudia know everything, and they're navigating their way through the church. And D. Michael Quinn kept his faith and testimony of the church, or rather the gospel, we'll say, even though he got excommunicated. So there were patterns for you to continue to stay in, even though your mind was spinning.
Yeah. And it wasn't even just that I had LDS mentors as well. I was very fortunate that my undergraduate professors were, I wouldn't say, highly practitioners necessarily, but we're all people who were people of faith in some degree. And we're like, you just work this out, you think through it and you figure it out. And so, I got to see how Catholics and Jews and Muslims would deal with these conflicts in their own traditions as well. And that was incredibly reassuring to feel like, oh, this isn't something that's only we're dealing with. Everybody's dealing with these issues,
right. And intellectuals and scholars are not all there to tear everything down. They're there just to present what the most accurate presentation of history or how things have come to be. That's all.
They're definitely a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
But
sure.
My experience,
in general, right?
Yeah, my experience has been, on the whole, as a lifelong scholar of religion at this point, over almost 30 years, that most professors are pretty accommodating to belief, and that's fine.
That's right. So you do the master's degree in what?
I did a master's degree in theological studies at Harvard Divinity School, and specialized in New Testament and early Christianity. I was then admitted to the doctoral program at Harvard Divinity School and finished my doctorate there in 2010, and was the second Latter-day Saint to finish a doctorate there in the history of the school. The first was Phil Barlow in the late 1970s, early 80s. I can't remember if he graduated in 79 or 80. But then it was a long time before me too. So, so that was my path. And I was fortunate that there were a lot of other LDS students who were studying religion in other doctoral programs there. Some lifelong friends of mine, and of course some other LDS faculty members like Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who became important mentors, and other amazing scholars that came out of that era, Nate Oman and Jared Hickman, among others, were people that I had long-standing friendships with, and we would study and think and start study groups and do all kinds of fun stuff. Again, really, really rich intellectual years for me in those in graduate school too.
So I remember hearing about graduate track advice, and some people would often say, whatever school you went for your master's, you should go to a different school for your doctorate because then you get a more richer experience. But going to Harvard for both degrees, to me, seems like something it would be hard to pass up.
It was hard to pass up. I loved it there. I had great mentors, great colleagues. I don't feel like I lost anything by staying there for both programs. Again, it was actually relatively rare for people to stay. And so I felt very honored that they chose me as one of the few to stick around. So, so I took advantage of it.
And so are you, as a graduate, as a doctoral program, and what's the doctoral program called? Is it the same?
It was in New Testament and early Christianity. Yeah. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Are you teaching freshmen at the same time as part of your work there?
Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, no. We did work as teaching assistants, but almost exclusively for graduate level classes. So we worked mostly with other graduate students. And occasionally I did teach some undergraduate classes. And towards the end of my time, I ended up getting hired as the associate director of undergraduate studies in religion. And so I ended up working with the religion majors that were undergraduates quite closely and would direct their senior research projects and so on. So I did end up working with them, but mostly out of the exception to the rule in the way that our program worked rather than the expectation. So we had relatively light teaching loads as graduate students so that we could focus on our research.
As you're approaching the end of your doctoral studies, you're starting to put out your resume, or were you going to stay there and work a little bit longer at that program?
Yeah, I came on the job market in 2009, so just a year after the 2008 financial crisis. And for people who were in academia at that time know that it was a really awful time. There had been maybe an average of like 20, 25 jobs a year that would come on the market in my field in the before times, as we used to call them. And then the financial crisis hit. Every single job that was out there was canceled. People who had job offers already, those offers were rescinded. And so it was a really, really brutal time. And so I went on the job market a year after that, not expecting to get anything and knowing that there was a backup of amazing people from the year before as well. And it was already not a great job market. Even before that, it wasn't ideal, but obviously was much more difficult. So I ended up applying to the 4 jobs that were there in the country at the time and got one of them, and was really blown away that had actually happened. I accepted it and never looked back. It's been an absolutely amazing experience. But yeah, it was a pretty scary time coming on the job market in those years. Yeah.
And what was that job then that you got?
So I'm a professor at Kalamazoo College in Michigan, which is a small liberal arts college. For people who are in Utah, it sort of is comparable to like a Westminster now university, but was college for a number of years there. So yeah, that's kind of the Midwestern liberal arts college vibe.
And what were your typical classes that you had?
I still teach there. I teach biblical studies. So I teach early Christianity, an Old Testament or a Hebrew Bible, and a New Testament class. I teach some classes on biblical interpretation, like a class called Sex in the Bible and another one called Race in the Bible. And I teach a lot of theory of religion classes as well for our upper division students.
Now, I know there's publish or perish. And were you already publishing as a master's or doctoral student?
No, we were not allowed to. Our professors said, don't do that. And
just help us.
Well, it wasn't even really helping them. They had a philosophy that I think that they've changed their minds on then, which is that publications at that early stage don't necessarily help you, but they might hurt you if they're not really, really, really good. And so they had this standard for us that anything you do in public, especially the early things that you do, have to be really, really, really good. So we were not allowed to. I didn't have a single publication when I went on the job market. And other than just like an essay or two here and there,
Right. So if you had written like a superb essay, they might then encourage you to make a paper out of it here and there for some students, or would
none of us?
That never happen?
I mean, one of my colleagues who is now a professor at Harvard was in the same situation. He didn't publish a single thing until he finished his doctoral program.
There you go.
So that was the rule back then. They've changed their mind on it. There's a whole new philosophy now. It was a little bit unusual even back then, but I didn't start writing and publishing until I was a faculty member, which was just out of school and my first job. And I started revising my dissertation and preparing that. And that ended up being my first book. And then, which is about early Christianity. And then wrote a couple of other articles and during that time as well. And that was also the time that I wrote my first Mormon studies piece for publication as well.
Yeah. But to give us an idea, so your dissertation is about how many pages, and then how big does the book become?
Oh, I don't know. I don't remember. Maybe the dissertation was like 350 typed pages, something like that. And a lot of that ended up getting cut out of my book because
so half goes away, and then not only another half, but maybe another third on top. Then it becomes a third or something.
Probably. So I have a very short first book. I was just invited last month at the Society of Biblical Literature to be on a panel among other prestigious scholars. I was very flattered to be invited to talk about our first books in early Christianity. So I was on this panel with all these amazing scholars, and we were all talking about our first book. Mine was by far the shortest at 105 pages or something like that. I joked about it, but yeah,
we'll say modest. It was modest,
but it was about a debate that I uncovered in early Christian literature that hadn't really been noticed by other scholars about whether or not resurrected bodies had genitals. And in the 100s and early 200s, Christians started having a pretty intense debate on this question.
Wow. And that's like a tie-in to Mormonism.
I think it was because I came from an LDS background that I noticed it. Right. Because other people were like, "Oh, that's not interesting at all," and I was like, "No, that's really interesting."
And is this debate occurring because it's letters written back and forth?
They are not quite letters, but they're treatises that they're writing. They're writing a bunch of defenses of the resurrection, and they're countering a lot of the objections, And so we have long treatises, but we don't have every voice, but we can sometimes reconstruct what the opposition was saying by what they're refuting. Does that make sense?
Right.
So they're saying, "Oh no, the resurrected body has all of its parts." And it's because they're arguing against other people who are saying, "No, you're not resurrected with your genitals. Why would you need your genitals in the afterlife?"
Right. So the genital argument gets thrown away, but the no genital argument stays, and you have to say there must have been this position.
Exactly.
Right? And as a debater, you would recognize that more as well.
Yeah.
So it was a perfect storm for you.
Yeah. So, and it ended up, being a lot about gender and sexuality. The dissertation was about other debates that were happening in the ancient world about gender and sexuality and how the Christians are kind of responding to some of those controversies. There are, non-binary philosophers that are becoming household names in the 2nd century. And the question of gender was really a live one that they were dealing with. Not only the role of women, which was a major project that they were working on as well, but what is the difference between male and female is something that they were intensely interested in working out. So that's what the dissertation of first book ended up being about, and that's what my early career at Kalamazoo College was spent on a lot of time doing.
Now, do people consider the Apostle Paul non-binary?
Not necessarily, but there are some teachings there that people do what are called so-called queer readings of Paul, and I have a lot of colleagues and people who I really respect who do fascinating work in that, and happy to make recommendations if people are interested in that.
Right, and so then you move on to your Mormon studies. What's the genesis of that?
Well, it never was completely gone. Even in graduate school, I was interested in it. Obviously, I had worked with Richard Bushman as an undergraduate and then as a fellow, but I had put a lot of that stuff to the side during my graduate studies because I realized that was what I needed to build my career in, and so I was developing that. Back then, it was very unusual, and the advice was for many of us at that stage not to work on Mormonism in graduate school because there weren't jobs. There weren't people who were going to hire you to do that. And so
not very many Mormon studies departments.
There were none at the time, and
Claremont wasn't even there.
Nope. Not when I was in graduate school. No.
Yeah.
And so one of now that I think about it, might have been like Richard Bushman had gone there the very tail end of my graduate, but I don't think so. I have to go back and double check the date. It's been a long time, but there were no jobs at the time. And the advice was, and it was something that was, I think, really meaningful and ended up being really influential for me, was learn another field and bring the things that you learn in that field to your perspective on Mormon studies.
Do you have to sort of convince your colleagues that this is the direction you want to go, and then get approval or acceptance, or let them know what you're doing so that they can maybe help you and find something and give you a resource or something? Or how does that work?
I did ask when I got there, when I was about to publish my first article, and I'll tell that story in a second, but I did ask when I got there and said, is it okay if I do this thing on the side? I know you've hired me to be an early Christianity person, but do you care if I do this?
Yeah, I won't get fired if I use the word Mormon in any of my papers, would you?
And they said, absolutely not. Here, it's absolutely fine. We're a religion department. We study religion. And as long as you're studying, if you're going to try to go be a biology expert on the side, maybe, but we would have some questions, but you're studying religion. That's what we do. The more religion, the better. And so they were very encouraging and very supportive. And that has been a huge blessing for me, especially to be at a small liberal arts college where I'm not required to teach graduate students. That it really helped my career to be able to kind of work in both fields.
Right. And even if you were interested in biology, you could be creative and say, what are the religious implications of cloning?
Yeah. and that's a perfectly fine question to ask in my department. So sometimes the expectations of specialization and field boundaries at bigger schools are more likely to be enforced than at smaller schools like mine, where, like I say, they were very supportive and very encouraging, and that's paid off really well for me. So, yeah.
Right. And so now your story about your first publication.
So how did that come about? How did I ended up writing on Mormon studies? Well, I had spent my graduate years studying gender and sexuality, and was versed in the latest greatest theories and all those conversations, and was working in a graduate program that was known for its strength in feminist and gender and queer readings of texts, and so had some of the best training that was available in the world at the time, and was very, very honored to have been immersed in that. Not only that, but one of my close colleagues was trans. One of my close colleagues was gay. There were many faculty and students who were far outside of the norms of heterosexual culture, and who were all studying religion, and who were, thinking about this stuff deeply. And I got to see, well, what are their traditions doing about this? And so this was the topic in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, that everybody was thinking about, I was living in Massachusetts, of course, at the time, and Mitt Romney was our governor, and same-sex marriage became legal in Massachusetts as the second state in the whole country where that happened in 2004. And the world didn't, go up in flames. Everything was fine. Everything was normal, And so these were the debates about same-sex marriage, the debates about sexuality and gender that were kind of, so much a part of the 90s and the early 2000s, really influenced how I was thinking as a graduate student and so on. And of course, people were blogging and debating same-sex marriage and Mormonism. And as the church gets involved in Prop 8, those debates got even fiercer. And I was reading and consuming everything that Latter-day Saints were saying about this stuff. And I, living in Boston also, for people who don't know, is sort of one of the major hubs of Mormon feminism. Exponent 2 is founded there and is its legacy and was still home base there. One of my best friends was the editor of Exponent 2 at the time. And, so
who was that again?
That was Amy Hickman at the time. And so, that was just, these were the questions that we were all thinking about constantly. And so as I was reading all this, I ended up just being really disappointed in the really smart things that some people were saying and thought, this is not great. And so I wrote an essay that was titled Toward a Post-Heterosexual Mormon Theology, where I tried to just ask the question that in many ways I've returned to in this most recent book of what is the place of heterosexuality in Mormon theology? Is it as central as people believe it to be, or perhaps less so? And I thought, well, I've said one thing on Mormon studies. That's the only thing I'll have to say. I'm back to early Christianity. And
you got it out of your system.
Yeah. Everyone's going to be convinced by what I have to say. And fortunately or unfortunately, that article kind of, for what could be called going viral back in the early 2010s, made a big splash, and a lot of people were talking and thinking about it. And it caused people to respond to it and me to kind of keep thinking about it, keep coming back to it. So I wrote a couple more articles, and then I was coming up on my first sabbatical. My first book had just come out, my early Christianity book. And I was thinking about what is a second project to work on. And I applied for a fellowship back at Harvard again in the Women's Studies and Religion program. Only 2 men in 40 years had ever been accepted into the program before. So I thought, there's no way that I'm going to get this. So it's fine. So I proposed a project on doing Mormon gender and sexual history, and not expecting to get it. And I thought, if I do get it, I'll do it. If I don't, then I'll work on this early Christianity book project instead. And I ended up getting it. And so then I had to write a book on the history of Mormon ideas about gender and sexuality. And that ended up being my second book, Tabernacles of Clay, Gender and Sexuality in Modern Mormonism.
And did you also feel like spiritually guided to do these things? Did you pray maybe, and even though it was a shot in the dark, getting accepted almost was an answer to your prayers?
I don't know if I was praying for it or against it so much, because it was hard. It was really a challenge. It cost a lot in my life in some ways to do that. And certainly, again, the benefits far outweighed the risk, but it was a challenge. And but I do feel very, very fortunate to have been at the right places at the right time for these opportunities to open themselves up. And I feel incredibly fortunate to have been able to take advantage of them and hopefully do something good with these opportunities that have been given to me.
And then your first Mormon book was?
That was the Tabernacles of Clay, Gender and Sexuality in Modern Mormonism, which is a history book. It was an attempt to. So after I wrote that theology article, I wrote a couple of other articles on Mormon theology and gender, and a lot of the response was basically, well, the theory is maybe right, or, that all sounds good and plausible, but the history is that Latter-day Saints have always believed this one thing about marriage and always believed this one thing about sexuality, and it's always been based on heterosexuality, and that's it. And I knew enough about history, and I knew enough about the study of sexuality and gender that I just had a sense there's no way that that's the case. Of course, that can't be the case. And just had a hunch that was true, and thought, well, if somebody needs to study this, as I said, I kind of looked around waiting for somebody else to do it, and thought, well, I guess I'll do it. Why not? I'll try it. And so the results of that book are a kind of historical upending of that consensus to demonstrate, as I think I have convincingly, that the church changes its position on gender and sexuality all the time, and has done so far more recently than people suspect. I thought I would be kind of talking about 19th century, the turn to monogamy a lot. I ended up not talking about that at all, and started after World War II, and said, I'm just going to chart these changes since World War II. And that's the book.
Is part of that Joseph Smith was sealed to other men?
I come to that point a little bit in my most recent book, in this Queering Kinship in the Mormon Cosmos. But in Tabernacles of Clay, I like I said, I don't really talk about Joseph Smith. I ended up I thought that I was going to find a lot in Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and it just ended up not being as interesting or as important, I felt like, to explain what was happening in the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s of why the church thought this. It wasn't because Joseph Smith said X, Y, or Z. And I realized that they were far more influenced by psychological and political trends around gender and sexuality than they were about anything that Joseph Smith had ever said. He said almost nothing about these issues, and they were kind of relying on what was happening in the modern world to formulate their opinions and the doctrines that the church ends up adopting that were not based in early Mormonism at all.
Right. And so your cover features the temple with a rainbow reflected temple. Mm-hmm. And how did people react to that?
I am so honored by the press's design for that. I didn't, they sort of came to me with that, and I was like, that is amazing. I love it. And, people came asking, oh, do you have a poster of this? I want to make, so people were really moved by the image. I thought it was, and I thought it expressed the theory of the book in a lot of ways as well, that there's this sort of undercurrent that disrupts the presumed heterosexuality of the tradition. It's a great cover, I think.
And how many years ago was that book?
That one came out in 2020, June 2020.
Okay.
So 4.5 years.
Right in the middle of COVID summer.
Yeah, I had a whole book tour planned, and it all fell apart. Oh well.
Did the publishing company ever have any projections like, here's what we think we lost because of COVID in sales or whatever?
I've never spoken with the publisher about it, but I did speak with a good friend, a colleague of mine, who had a book come out around the same time. And their perspective was maybe actually COVID was really good for books, because we didn't have anything else to do but read books and be online and talk about books, And so that was, I thought, oh, that's an interesting perspective. Maybe it wasn't so bad for us after all.
That's right. Zoom meetings, podcasting.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff happening.
Yeah,
I know the actors.
A way to distract us from all the horrors that were happening around us, I suppose. But
yeah. So then it's time to move on to the next project, right? How many sabbaticals do you get?
One every 7 years. So
okay, yeah. So you had to do this without a sabbatical. For the next book.
Yeah, this one was without a sabbatical. In a way, the origins of this book actually are a part of the previous book as well. The original, way overambitious project was to do a history and a theology at the same time, and I was going to do one book that was going to do it all. Okay. And everybody kept telling me all year while I was on fellowship at Harvard, that sounds like 2 books. Every time you talk about it, it sounds like it's 2 books. But I couldn't bring myself to imagine that I would have to write a whole nother book after I had finished one. I was like, I'm not doing 2. So I ended up cutting all of the theology out of it and sat on it for a little while, and couldn't stop thinking about it, kept coming back to, well, okay, I could add this, and this is what this would look like. And I thought, well, maybe I'll republish some of my older essays and add in some new stuff. And I ended up cutting out all of the old stuff, writing all new stuff, and feeling like, all right, hopefully this is something smart to say, to come back to this question of the theology. Does the theology require heterosexuality or not? And that's the question that I asked on this book, and hopefully people find it interesting.
So the other book was more about the history, and this is more about the theology.
Correct.
Queering Kinship in the Mormon Cosmos. Yeah. And we'll provide a link to that book. And are there any other things around the publication of it, or pre-publication? Like, you write a book and then you're an author, but you have editorial input from the publisher?
The publisher sends it out to other experts in the field to give, their critical feedback. They're anonymous, so that they can, be honest with you about it.
Sure.
And
not to be political or anything like that.
Right. And,
maintain friendship.
Exactly. It's an imperfect process, but it's probably the best one that there is. So yeah, I went out for review, and I was very fortunate to get smart, thoughtful reviews that I think made the book better in the end. And challenged some of the ways that I had framed things, some of the ways that I approached things, some of the ways that I had written about some problems. And but overall, very, very positive. And so yeah, I feel very fortunate so far to have gotten really strong positive reviews, not only from the press's reviewers, but an early reception of the book. Though it's only been out, I don't know when this will actually release.
October 1st or whatever.
Yeah. 2.5 months ago or so. So people are still kind of just getting it started on it.
Yeah. And so that makes me think, like, so you have acknowledgments, and you acknowledge the people that helped you up to the point of being involved with the publisher. Then the publisher sends it to anonymous people, and you credit your point person at the publication as thank you for all your help. But really, it's a whole bunch of anonymous helpers, scholars that contribute a lot towards the end.
Every book, well, these academic books go through so many rounds of review and revision and reanalysis, and it's years and years and years of work for people, and it often relies on the labor of friends and in some cases anonymous strangers to help you to get it better. And
so 5 years from now, you might be on a panel and somebody says, "Hey, I got to help. I may help you make that change in chapter 3."
Yeah.
And then you say, "Thank you."
Well, I did find out. Now, sometimes they come up to you and they tell you who they are, or they tell the press, you can tell. So I do know who my reviewers were at the end of the stage of it.
Sure.
One of them is they both ended up blurbing the book, which was very kind of them. One of them is Patrick Mason, who's the Mormon Studies chair at Utah State University, and the other is Melissa Wilcox, who is a queer studies and religion scholar at University of California, Riverside. Absolutely amazing, a prolific, brilliant leader in the field, and very, very honored to have their perspective on this book. So, because I wanted not just Mormon studies people to read this. I wanted it to have a broader impact in the field of queer studies and religion.
Right. We recently had Patrick Mason and Gregory Prince on in a Remembering Leonard Arrington episode.
Yeah.
And Patrick said he would come back and talk about some more things later about around that subject.
I know this is a side note, but Greg and others have contributed pieces honoring and remembering Lester Bush, which is another founding figure in modern Mormon studies, in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. I'm also the editor at Dialogue right now for another about 6 months or so. And very honored to publish a roundtable discussing the legacy and impact of Lester Bush's work too, with Greg Prince as one of our contributors.
That's right. Maybe we could have you back and talk about Dialogue and your work there, and what you know about the founding and history, or if there's other people we could bring on, like a little dialogue panel.
Yeah,
dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Taylor, for coming on our show. Everybody buy his book or books. Have a great rest of the year. Christmas is coming, and this would make a good gift for somebody, right? I bet. So hopefully this is a good time for a book to come out. It gets on lists. Is it doing well in Amazon or anything?
I haven't looked recently. I do know that the press has said that there's been a lot of interest, so that's nice. But I haven't looked to quantify it at all. But I will say one more thing about it, that all of the proceeds from this book are being donated to Affirmation, the oldest LGBTQ organization affiliated with the church or in relationship to the church. And just want to let people know that their money to buy the book also supports Affirmation.
Right. Can you throw a couple of names of people that are working with Affirmation now, or founders, or do you know any of those?
The current president is Fred Bowers, who I just met for the first time, actually, when I spoke at the Affirmation conference a couple of months ago. And I'm working with their history committee right now, but it's a fascinating organization dating back to 1978, 1979. Nearly 50 years now that there has been an LGBTQ organization for Mormons, and it's pretty impressive and amazing history.
We'll have an Affirmation show someday in the future too. So, all right. Thanks everyone for watching. Do the things, like, subscribe, share with your friends. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.